let's talk about Northwest of Earth by C.L. Moore in the Golden Age Masterworks range. This is a new range from Gollancz, like Sci-Fi Masterworks or the erstwhile Fantasy Masterworks. You can see it's got similar livery. It is, I guess, it's stylistically, with the Metropolis style font and stuff, is meant to look older and hark back to classics. It's pushing people marketing wise towards stuff they might not pick up otherwise. Oh, it's the Golden Age. This is about Northwest Smith, who is a sort of noir slash western slash John Carter of Mars hero. He's a combo of all three. This is basically neo-noir, neo-western J. Edgar, Edgar Rice Burroughs. J. Edgar, imagine that. Imagine if J. Edgar Hoover and Edgar Rice Burroughs were the same person. But yes, this is basically Edgar Rice Burroughs, but neo-noir, neo-western. It is darker, it's grittier. Written in the 30s and 40s. C.L. Moore was a very gifted writer, also very well known for Jarrell Joyery or Joyery, which I also have. I haven't read. There is a Jarrell crossover story in here. We'll get to that. But that's pulp fantasy set in medieval France, I think. This is set in the future. I guess a couple of thousand years in the future, maybe, or 1,000 years, I think, something like that. And Northwest Smith adventures around the ruins of Mars and adventures around the fertile, silvery planet of Venus. He occasionally is on Earth. He's once on a moon of Jupiter. He has this one weird crossover. It's Sword and Planet, and it will remind us of the sort of planet. So I did a video on Sword and Planet, and that is its main genre. I read it as a sort of archetypal space western, and that is also something to talk about. It is more of a space western, certainly, than Lee Brackett or Ray Bradbury or Edgar Rice Burroughs or Kim Stanley Robinson or Andy Weir, certainly. But in terms of Mars fiction, Sword and Planet fiction, it is its own distinctive thing. It is closest to Lee Brackett, which I find interesting, by the way, these two prominent female writers of Sword and Planet particularly. It is also, have this very distinctive, often quite neo-noir-y, neo-western, modern western, future western feel. It's also it's also closer in terms of the kinds of planets we're looking at to Brackett, Burroughs, C.S. Lewis, somewhat Ray Bradbury, but as I think I discussed in my Mars Chronicles review for him, that's his kind of vision of Mars, and in terms of my discussion, my video on Sword and Planet. Bradbury is doing a slightly different thing, but yeah, basically those early writers who Bradbury is essentially riffing on and pastiching, who have the planets as these livable places that are much like us. A particular gimmick here, compared to Burroughs, say, is that the inhabitants of the three great planets are human. They're all human. They're obviously distantly related in some way, and there are some hints about where that's maybe come from. It's a more coherent Sword and Planet universe than Brackett, and by that I mean it's the same point of view character and the same sort of general vibe and stuff. But with Brackett, you have some stuff that's obviously in continuity with each other, some stuff that is like, that doesn't really make sense with this. Mercury's different in these two. Brackett goes more broad and sees more places. Moore is even stronger on atmosphere. Compared to Burroughs, who is, again, the obvious one, and Moore is essentially, I guess, the second major writer doing this sort of thing. There may be others in the 20s, I grant. But she beats C.S. Lewis, for instance, to it. Lewis is obviously riffing on Burroughs. He's developing from Burroughs. I think, and I should say, all of this is certainly influenced as well by War of the Worlds, by Wells, the idea of an intelligent race that's kind of not like us, but can breathe the same atmosphere, on atmospherically similar planets. But yeah, more compared to Burroughs, I think the big thing you're going to pick up with Moore, like Brackett, but even more so, and this is is the depth of character, and I think there's some prevailing themes that somewhat differ between books, but also there's some strong commonalities in themes in lots of the short stories or whatever. which I think are much more intensive, psychologically intense, and framed in a more literary manner than in Burroughs or indeed Brackett. Moore is probably of those three the most literary, and in some senses, I think she is of the three the superior intellectually. I think Burroughs is probably ultimately along with the best Sword and Planet writer as pure Sword and Planet, though I think Lewis challenges him, albeit ironically, chiefly with that hideous strength which is set on Earth. But yes, the kind of, you got the same vibes of decaying Mars or fertile Venus, relatively speaking, and Venus certainly in Lewis and in I think actually in Brackett isn't it some swampy hell, but in Lewis and in Burroughs, Venus is in different ways very fertile and nice. And it's like that here, except we'll get to this. It still has some of the weird stuff that goes on in her universe, that kind of general thing. There are things like the fact that we get an Earth that is significant and in the future. So compared to Lewis or Burroughs, who have our Earth, and so we're travelling from our Earth. And Brackett has a future Earth, but obviously it changes between stuff, and we don't really see it. Earth is never important, whereas Burroughs and Lewis do care about Earth. They write many stories on Earth. And remember, Burroughs is one of the earliest shared sci-fi universe. I don't know if he actually is the earliest, but one of the earliest, because Tarzan goes to Pellucidar and Carson of Venus. In that book you hear about that adventure, and John Carter is known to all these people. All these books are interrelated. And yeah, that's our world, but it's now Brackett and Lewis the same with that hideous strength. That doesn't happen in Brackett. We don't go there, but here we do have stories on Earth, albeit they're fairly limited, and you get much more of a feel of the Earth that Smith has come from. Missing home is a thematic link between all the stories. Let's talk about the kind of prevailing themes. I should say, maybe before I say that, stylistically, there's some early ticks which are interesting, which then disappear, so they're not worth commenting now. But there are things where basically she has good style, is very clear, it's concise, it's written in a pulpy fashion, which the great strength of pulp is you get lots done. If there is limitation, it's that sometimes you wish you spent more time on something, and she very rarely has the time to spend much time on atmospherics. That's the pulp style. It's getting something into the magazine. It is a good discipline, I suspect, to learn, and I think you can see the fact that it's why did D&D books get printed more often and they were longer and they were worse? Well, paper was cheaper. Fiction is affected by the same thing, is that if someone gets their deal and has an audience, they can write very long books, and we see this in fantasy is the most obvious place, and to a degree sci-fi. Very long books, which may or may not be good, but you're often left thinking, possibly some compression, some editorial pressure would be good there. Anyway, Northwest of Earth, stylistically, very easy to read on the whole. You just have to be used to that convention. Thematically and sort of atmospherically, there are particular prevailing and sort of returning themes. So, say, Earth mythical monsters are actually space aliens and we get to meet them. That's a very common one. The dangers of and around addiction and sex. Shambleau, maybe her most famous story, certainly, and it's the first one she wrote for Northwest of Earth. It's the first one in the collection. That deals with that and touches on all of those first 2 points I've made. I think she also has, and I take it there's probably some influence from Lovecraft here, or maybe Merritt, but there is a great concern with not space and planets being terrifying, but there being eldritch dark forces requiring human sacrifice, essentially, is very common. Or, at least being dangerous to humans, not actually specifically that, but like that there are these powers often in ruins or in the past or on the edge of things or associated with artifacts. And this is a returning thing. And these as recurrent concerns does suggest to me we're not just talking about, she can be bothered to come up with something different. The way she presents them and the intensity with which she presents these themes. These are things which she is chewing over psychologically, philosophically, whatever, whatever's going on with her. It doesn't matter, in that sense. But I think there is obviously something interesting going on where she's trying to work out in the book what, I guess what she thinks, but also the human experience of this. It's an attempt to cathartically capture these fears and these terrors, I think. And that leads actually to an interesting thing where Smith, you get touches of that elsewhere, but you get it in Lewis, and Lewis deals with that in a particular way. He's perfectly into the idea of dark and eldritch forces, which man does not understand, but though occasionally has to take a rock to. But you don't get that in Burroughs really at all ever. And Brackett, there's bits of kind of weird old stuff, but it's less so. I think more this is pervasive. I think it's interesting that she emphasises, though she takes the Burroughsian and indeed 19th century image of a dry, formerly wet, but now dry Mars. That's obviously not a Burroughs idea. Indeed, it's not even a strictly sci-fi idea. But and this means there's these civilizations. She spends a lot more time, I think the way the civilizations feel is a lot more serious and anthropological. And I think that's a serious thing, is that she's interested in what other near humans are like, people like, and she has 3 near human species, I think, in these. I think she's interested in these books, Northwest Smith as a character, and his friend, particularly who he often works with, Yarrol the Venusian. I think that you don't see as much of Yarrol's interiority, absolutely, and he's an interesting character. But with Smith, I think he has these pulp hero features. He's stalwart and incorruptible, but he's also very, and this goes back to my beginning to make this point about Lovecraft throughout the comparisons. Actually, a lot of stuff is too powerful, really, for Smith. The universe is very scary and difficult and dangerous, and it's not that with a single bound, well, good, Mars has weaker gravity, so you can jump really high, like in Burroughs. That solves the problem. Rather, Smith is dwarfed by these things, and sometimes he has his own courage or skill or a bit of incidental luck. Sometimes he relies on something else or someone else, but he does not have it his own way. In most of the stories, there are many disasters, and the disasters are not John Carter type ones of, more or less accidentally being bopped on the head. They are things that come from this vision of that behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz is not a friendly little man. I liked all that a lot. I think the issue of prevalent themes, as I say, particularly around sex and somewhat addiction, are exceptionally prevalent, and the first 2/3 of the book, I think all the stories kind of float around that, basically. And that's sometimes those stories work very well, so it's not they're not very good because of that. I think it's that she's doing there's an aria and there's variations. Shamblo is the aria, and then there are many variations. But it does make it repetitive to read comparatively, because you're like, this is that moment. And this is the thing about the magazine story you read once a month. It's not repetitive because you're only reading it once a month. In a book, it is more repetitive. And in that sense, short story collections like this, variety in place, helps, because you kind of see different things, different aspects of what's going on and what the author's concerned about. I'd say that ends, though those themes don't wholly go away, but in fact, strictly, the issue of feminine beauty, sometimes quite positively framed, sometimes often framed as very dangerous, never disappears. But from Lost Paradise, which is about 2/3 of the way through, Lost Paradise, it probably might be the best story. It's certainly one of the most beautifully written and one of the most compelling, and is one that relies on a different set of concerns. In that sense, though, there is an instance of physical beauty, that's actually not particularly a concern. There is something else going on about forbidden knowledges and about material predestination and the thing, you know, how we get caught up in stuff we don't understand and wish we weren't. That's a very good one, I think it's fair to say. And there are just a few more varied stories thereafter. Tree of Life immediately afterwards does have, again, dangers of beauty or whatever, but is really about something else, and has a very, very kind of effective setting and antagonist. Quest the Starstone. This is I haven't read any Joiry or whatever, but this is a very strong crossover. Not perfect, but it's interesting. Partly because you realise Jorel is nuts, basically, as far as I can tell. Northwest is basically an okay guy who is a bit criminal. I mean, and hey, we can always dispute the kind of morality around that, but like, he's a bit criminal, but he's not vicious, he's not cruel. Whereas Jorel is an expert on torture, and that's an interesting set of inversions. But the fact that you have this sort of man who could be in a different universe, could just be a hero, and sometimes is, he gets caught up. Basically, the setup is an evil warlock that Jorel has defeated, time travels and gets Northwest and accidentally Yarol to come. That's obviously a thing, by the way, that more likes Yarol and brings him along on adventures he doesn't need to be on. But like, they get dragged along to come and defeat Jorel and get a jewel back. And they don't realise what's going on. They're like, oh, I guess, especially because that's their way home. They're like, yeah, fine, we'll go and get this jewel. And then obviously Smith is like, wait a second, something weird's going on. Werewoman is one of the strangest stories. And it's Wolfian in terms of, not in terms of narrative, it's a sort of limited third person eye. It's via Smith, but it's not Smith's own claims about things. But just the fact that he doesn't understand what's going on in this whole story, and so we don't, but that's okay because we understand what that he doesn't understand. Werewoman is the last full-length story and is very interesting, and I'll have to reread it, I think, just to try to get at it a bit, and try to work out the exact narrative. And Song in a Minor Key, which closes as a coda, is very effective too. And the themes never stop being there. The themes I've said, eldritch powers, and I guess the kind of issue of contingency in violence and in fate, and the dangers of beauty, as is obvious. Lots of these themes come back again and again, but he does begin to vary. She does begin to vary this a bit with Smith. Like he does begin to be involved in different stories. So yes, there's an issue of slight repetition that is going to work better in a monthly magazine than in a book you're reading and trying to be like, oh yeah, I'm going to read this in a few weeks or something. There is not a page of contents, which you could say, well, just read the book. But given that I'm aware that this is a book of short stories, I actually kind of want to know those lengths better for various reasons. But yes, I like the fact it has the crossover. I like the fact, I love her setting. I think her vision of the Sword and Planet world is as good or better, probably. You know, in many ways it's the most granular and deepest and most interesting of all the great early Sword and Planet writers who are writing about these living planets. And I think her character depth it's not Lewis, and it's maybe in many ways more similar to Brackett, but I would say it's probably a bit more psychologically intense and serious than Brackett. But yeah, I liked it a lot. Pretty clearly one of those kind of unjustly forgotten authors and books. I do recommend it if you're into the kind of the genres we mentioned: space western, Sword and Planet, neo-noir. That's one thing, and the neo-noir thing slightly actually fades out, but in the early stories there is a strong influence, I think, from the noir. Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.